Evening, everyone. My name is Thomas Woodley. I'm the president of Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, or CJPME, and I'd like to welcome you to our session here tonight entitled, Is BDS Illegal or Anti-Semitic? Breaking Down Common Myths. Thanks, everyone, for joining us here tonight. Tonight's event was actually inspired by a request by one of our local chapters a few months ago, and this local chapter wanted to do more BDS work, but felt that they needed a bit more coaching and support material. So this is part of a series of sessions that we're doing on the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement targeting Israel. So the previous session was actually entitled BDS 101, How to Join the Movement. It's available on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, or on our Facebook page. It was delivered about 6 weeks ago, but you can go ahead and take a look at that, and I think you'll enjoy it. It covers some of the basics. We will touch on some of the basics here again tonight, but if you really want the full basics, I encourage you to take a look at that video. We are planning a number of other sessions on BDS in the coming months that we'll talk about BDS on campus, BDS, say, for instance, in the labor movement, and so on and so forth. There are lots of things that we want to explore and lots of things that we can learn together. So during tonight's event, there'll sort of be three different parts of the event. During the first part, our initial panelist, Michael Bookert, will talk about anti-Semitism and the BDS movement, and whether how to understand or how to respond to accusations of anti-Semitism towards the BDS movement. Then Michael's going to invite another panelist, Yavar Hameed, who is a lawyer, a Canadian lawyer, who has actually dealt with cases regarding BDS, and get a perspective, the legal perspective on the BDS movement here in Canada. And finally, we'll turn it back over to some Q&A at the end of the evening. We welcome anyone to submit questions during the Q&A portion. You'll have the opportunity to submit your questions by pressing the Q&A button at the bottom of your control panel, and we'll try to cover as many questions as we possibly can during that time. Honored as we are to have Yavar Hameed with us here tonight as one of our guests. We will say, as we say with all speakers, that Yavar's views and opinions are his own and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of CJPME. So thank you again, Yavar, for joining us. He'll be introduced a little bit later. We do plan to wrap up our evening after about an hour, maybe an hour and a bit. So we will try to be punctual on that. Just a word about CJPME before I invite Michael to begin. CJPME is an organization whose mission is to empower Canadians of all backgrounds to promote justice, development, and peace in the Middle East and here at home in Canada. We do a whole variety of things: advocacy campaigns, policy analysis, speaking tours, training, lobbying to politicians, and many other things. We have well over 100,000 adherents in Canada, with local volunteers who help us in virtually all of Canada's major cities. When it comes to empowering Canadians, I can think of no better way than doing a BDS training like we're doing today. Of course, the events of the past 3 weeks have upset many of us, and many of us feel frustrated and unable to really have an impact on things. But the BDS movement is one way that all of us can be involved in a very personal and very direct way in putting economic pressure on Israel so that it stops its human rights abuses against the Palestinians. So we find it very practical and very democratic, as it can be practiced by anyone, anywhere. So if you're like me, you're angered by Israel's human rights abuse against the Palestinians, BDS is a way to direct your anger and frustration and stand up and do something tangible for the Palestinians. And so let's hope that this is a turning point. We've had actually a number of emails coming to us, people wanting to get involved. So this is one of our first suggestions in terms of getting involved, is to get involved in the BDS movement. So we do encourage you, and we welcome any questions here tonight or on our email platform if you have questions following the webinar. So now to introduce our first presenter tonight, Dr. Michael Bookert. Michael has his PhD in sociology with a specialization in political economy from Carleton University. His dissertation compared opposition to the BDS movement targeting Israel to opposition to the boycott of South Africa. And he'll address that briefly this evening at the very end of our program time. Michael has published in Radical History Review and Studies in Political Economy. He has written for publications including Jacobin and Briar Patch. His research has been cited by the Washington Post, BuzzFeed News, CBC Ottawa, the South African Broadcast Corporation, the Electronic Intifada, and others. He has held several positions in the student movement, including as president of the Carleton University Graduate Students Association. And he joined CJPME as vice president about a year ago in June 2020. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Bookert.
Thank you, Tom. We should also say that tonight, many of us are watching from Turtle Island, the different places in Turtle Island, on often in many cases unceded and unsurrendered Indigenous territory. In Montreal, we're coming from the traditional land of the Mohawk Nation, which was also the traditional meeting site for many First Nations. And so I did want to recognize that the struggle for human rights and against settler colonialism begins at home, even as in many ways we are trying to resist the settler colonial pressures in Palestine, especially we're watching now in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem as people are being forced from their homes. And so it's really important that we remember this. And it's actually been really, I did want to note that Idle No More, a fantastic Indigenous movement, has made a statement of solidarity with the Palestinian people this week, or perhaps last week, which is really appreciated as these struggles are in common. So I did want to mention that. I'll start by saying a bit of a recap about BDS in case this is new to anyone. So BDS is the international movement urging the use of boycotts, divestment, and sanctions against Israel in order to put pressure on Israel to stop violating Palestinian human rights and to respect international law. BDS is a movement that was launched in 2005, endorsed at the time by 170 Palestinian civil society groups. It's an invitation from Palestinians to the international community, directed to all of us, asking us to join them in their struggle for justice. BDS is also a set of pressure tactics of actions that we can use in different places in our lives. A boycott is something that we can use as a consumer in our daily purchasing choices. Divestment is something you can do in your institution. For example, perhaps your church has investments that you can divest from the Israeli occupation, or your pension fund, or a university endowment. Sanctions is what governments do. And of course, we have a role in pushing politicians to act, and very encouraged to see over the last couple of weeks, Canadian politicians, for the first time, really articulating the need for Canada to put pressure on Israel through the use of sanctions, including an arms embargo. So that has been fantastic. And all of these things are tools that we can use to put pressure on Israel. So to have a more in-depth introduction to BDS, please do see our previous webinar, which is online. And you can watch it on YouTube, which goes much deeper into these questions about what are the goals of BDS, how does it work, who is the BDS National Committee, and that kind of thing. But today I did want to talk about some of the misconceptions around BDS and some of the false claims that say that BDS is either anti-Semitic or that it is against the law. So these are claims often from Israel supporters that are intended to silence opposition to Israel's violations of human rights and international law, and to discourage politicians from putting any pressure on Israel. As a note, of course, anti-Semitism is real and a problem throughout Canadian society. It is possible for anti-Semitic acts and behavior to be carried out by individuals who also support BDS. Now, this is a bigger question that we're not going to be exploring in full in this webinar. I will note that any anti-Semitism would be a violation of BDS guidelines. As we discussed in our last webinar, BDS is an anti-racist movement, and it's opposed to all forms of oppression, including anti-Semitism. The point of this workshop, again, is not to discuss actual anti-Semitism in Canadian society, but to push back against some of the false claims that are made against BDS, against the BDS movement, and which are intended to silence Palestinian dissent. So hopefully through some of this information, we can together learn how to recognize some of these myths about anti-Semitism and to defend BDS as a legitimate and necessary tool to promote Palestinian human rights. So one of the main ways that Israel tries to silence its opposition is by trying to misrepresent BDS. Instead of recognizing it as a movement for justice, Israel supporters try to characterize it as a hateful movement that targets Jewish Canadians and Israelis. To make this argument, there are a few different tools and strategies that pro-Israel groups will often rely on, and I think it's worth talking through some of these briefly. You may have heard of some of these before: the new anti-Semitism thesis, the 3Ds of anti-Semitism, the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, and the idea of discrimination based on national origin. So first, there's the new anti-Semitism thesis. This idea really started to become popular in the early 2000s with the first Intifada. One of the key people who developed this idea is actually Irwin Cotler, a former Canadian cabinet minister and now Canada's special envoy for combating anti-Semitism. According to this argument, anti-Israel sentiments are driving a new resurgence in anti-Semitic activity. In this view, critics of Israel are often accused of hiding their anti-Semitism behind the mask of being anti-Israel or pro-Palestinian. However, this idea is based on an incorrect assumption about what motivates BDS. It suggests that those who protest Israel are not really motivated by human rights and injustice, but by their hatred for Jews. This completely erases the idea that people would protest Israel out of a genuine concern for or solidarity with Palestinians. And so people who use this talking point can't understand why someone would be so outraged over Israel's apartheid practices. And so they assume that people must just hate Israelis because they're Jewish. Now, this is obviously insulting to Palestinians and to anyone who is genuinely worried about the facts on the ground. Related to the new anti-Semitism thesis is the 3Ds of anti-Semitism, or the 3D test. Many of you have probably come across this before. So this was a very popular tool which was developed to show when criticism of Israel crosses the line into anti-Semitism. Even Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has promoted this framework as a way to understand anti-Semitism. Following this method, any criticism about Israel is evaluated against 3 Ds. So there's demonization, as when Israel's actions are blown out of all sensible proportion. 2 is double standards, as when Israel is singled out or criticism is applied selectively. And then there's 3, delegitimization, which is when Israel's fundamental right to exist is denied. If the criticism of Israel in question is determined to meet any of these criteria, then it's deemed anti-Semitic. So there's a lot of problems with the 3 Ds, but the most fundamental issue is that these claims are all entirely subjective. What exactly does it mean to demonize Israel? And how should we identify a double standard and when it's being used? There's no clear definition of these terms that we can work with, and so ultimately it comes down to one's personal opinion. So therefore we see pro-Israel groups use this argument in response to virtually any criticism about Israel, whether it's by the Canadian government or the United Nations. Anything and everything can be sort of portrayed as a demonization of Israel. And since it can be applied to virtually any criticism, it's pretty much useless as a tool for analysis. However, because the 3Ds are so common, it's worth breaking them down in terms of some of the specific points. So first, does it make sense to say that Israel is being singled out by BDS? Why does BDS focus on Israel in the first place? On the one hand, this is because BDS is a direct response to the call from Palestinian civil society, who has asked for our solidarity. On the other hand, Canada has a very close relationship with Israel. This means that Canada is complicit in Israel's actions and has a responsibility to act, but also that Canadians have considerable influence to change Israel's behavior, more than influence over other countries. So rather than inappropriately singling Israel out, BDS is a completely logical tool, a completely logical response to a specific situation of injustice. Second, does BDS hold Israel to a double standard? The answer is no, of course not. BDS simply seeks to apply universal standards to Israel, standards about human rights and international law, just as we expect to see from any country. Israel itself is a signatory to the Fourth Geneva Convention and has a responsibility to uphold that convention. Moreover, BDS does not hold Israel to any higher standard than it sets for itself. There are countries that commit equal or greater human rights violations, but they don't claim to be Western democratic societies, and they don't seek to be recognized as such. So if Israel claims to be a democracy, if it wants to be celebrated on the world stage as being, a wonderful democracy, it has to act like one, and it's not currently. So the idea of a double standard just doesn't make any sense. If anything, there's a single standard that Israel is being asked to meet. So third, does BDS seek to delegitimize or to destroy Israel? It's important to emphasize that when Israel supporters, when they say this, when they say that BDS wants to destroy Israel, what they usually mean is that they're referring to very specific demands, which they believe are anti-Semitic. So on the one hand, you have the right of return. One of the demands of BDS is for the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes, as stipulated by UN Resolution 194. Israel supporters will say that allowing refugees to return would change the demographics in Israel and make Israeli Jews a minority, and therefore undermine the Jewish character of the state of Israel. And they say that this would be anti-Semitic. The second is the idea of a binational state. So many Palestinians, including some supporters of BDS, but not all, are no longer interested in a two-state solution, but prefer a single democratic state in which Israelis and Palestinians would live together in a single state with equal rights. Once again, Israel supporters say that this is anti-Semitic because it undermines the specifically Jewish character of Israel. In both of these cases, the loss of Jewish supremacy and dominance is presented as the destruction of Israel as a Jewish state. However, both demands are consistent with international law and with the principle of equality. So they represent equal rights and freedom for all peoples, and the extension of democracy to every person, regardless of their identity. As with the end of apartheid in South Africa, extending equal rights wouldn't destroy Israel, but it would make Israel an actual democracy. And speaking of South Africa, it is worth mentioning briefly that the same arguments that are often used with the 3D test were frequently deployed against the anti-apartheid movement against South Africa in the 70s and 80s. South Africa's supporters would argue that the country was being singled out for criticism, that it was being held to double or even triple standards, and that if apartheid ended, it would result in the violent destruction of South African society itself. Or in the case of this cartoon from the mid-80s, here you can see a bear representing the Soviet Union coming down upon South African industries and saying, "We shall drive South Africa into the sea." So the idea that the demand for equality would be depicted as the destruction of society and as a violent act, that is not new. That is something that South Africa's supporters also talked about. Of course, very few people bought these arguments, and fewer still thought that these arguments proved that the boycott of South Africa was somehow racist against white South Africans. It was absurd then, and it's absurd now. Now, despite the significant problems with the 3D framework, it has nonetheless been incorporated into a popular new definition of anti-Semitism called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance Working Definition of Anti-Semitism, or what I'll just call IRA. Again, many of you may be familiar with this. This is a definition of anti-Semitism which has been adopted by a number of governments and institutions, including the federal Canadian government and the province of Ontario. CJPME and other human rights groups have been very opposed to the adoption of IRA because we see that it conflates criticism and protest of Israel with anti-Semitism. What's particularly of concern is that the definition is accompanied by these examples of anti-Semitism, which are likely to suppress speech about Israel and Zionism. So, for example, IRA says that it's anti-Semitic when someone is applying double standards by requiring of Israel a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. As we've seen before with the 3Ds, this is entirely subjective and can be applied to almost any form of criticism if someone thinks it's unfair. And it can apply to pretty much any time that someone thinks that criticism is too harsh against Israel, even though the reality on the ground is particularly harsh and demands a serious response. IRA also claims that it's anti-Semitic when someone is denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. This aspect of IRA directly targets criticism which makes claims about the racist character of Israel. This potentially poses a problem for anyone looking at Israel from the perspective of its discriminatory actions and policies targeting Palestinians. It would be like forbidding someone from suggesting that Canada struggles with racism or that it has a history of racism, or from talking about Canada in terms of settler colonialism and anti-Indigenous racism. So, and the other thing too is that this idea of denying Jewish people their right to self-determination, usually, again, what they're talking about here specifically is the end to the specifically Jewish character of Israel and the extension of equal rights to everyone who lives there. So democracy is once again depicted as the denial of self-determination and anti-Semitism. Now, while pro-Israel groups will deny that IRA is intended to silence speech, at CJPME, we've been pointing out many examples of the same groups saying out loud that specific criticism of Israel violates IRA. So, for example, they'll look at Canada voting for Palestinian self-determination at the United Nations and say, this is a double standard, this is demonizing Israel, therefore this violates IRA, it's anti-Semitic. But anti-Zionism, BDS and campus activism, anti-Israel scholarship in universities. There are countless examples, and I put here a screenshot from an article that we wrote for Canadian Dimension, compiling a bunch of these, and we'll make sure that a link to that is available. So you can see how pro-Israel groups specifically see IRA as a way that they can push institutions to shut down speech. And we'll talk a bit more about IRA a little bit later. But the last claim about anti-Semitism and BDS that I wanted to touch on tonight is the idea that BDS amounts to discrimination against Israelis and Jewish Canadians based on their nationality. Some pro-Israel groups have started to make this argument to suggest that BDS may violate anti-discrimination laws and policies. So of course, this is completely false. First, BDS does not target individuals based on being Jewish or Israeli. Instead, BDS seeks to boycott companies and institutions which are complicit in Israel's violation of Palestinian human rights. Second, the idea that BDS is discrimination is obviously absurd if you compare BDS with similar boycott movements. So, for example, the South African anti-apartheid movement boycotted South African products in Canada, but nobody said that that was a form of discrimination against South Africans as a nationality. Just on the face of it, it's absurd. And this line of reasoning would actually make a boycott of any country illegitimate. If a boycott of Mexico, for example, if you wanted to boycott Mexico, treating that as discriminating against nationality, you could apply to any specific case. And of course, boycotting a country is a democratic thing that we can participate in. It's not discrimination. And there's just decades and decades of practice and experience showing that these kinds of protest tools can lead to justice and to social change. So it's just absurd. And in fact, this was the conclusion of the Harvard Law Review last year, which said that BDS cannot be considered discriminatory even on a philosophical basis. So it's definitely a stretch they're making, but again, they're trying to muddy the waters and make it seem as though BDS is something that we should hesitate to participate in. So those are some of the main ways that pro-Israel groups have tried to argue that BDS is anti-Semitic, all of which are completely false. We can discuss more in the Q&A later if there's some interest, but now I'd like to move the discussion to focus on the legal right to boycott Israel. With all the false claims from pro-Israel groups, as well as the various condemnations of BDS from politicians, there can be some confusion about your right to participate in BDS as a Canadian. The bottom line, which is important to mention up front, is that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms says that everyone is entitled to freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression. This means that your right to boycott Israel is protected by the Charter. And this is something that a federal judge affirmed in a decision in 2019, in fact, and there's a lot of evidence behind this. But to get into these issues in more detail, I'd like to bring in our featured guest, Yavar Hameed. Yavar, you can bring on your video. Yavar is an Ottawa-based human rights lawyer who has worked on cases related to employment discrimination, police brutality, racial profiling, deportation of migrants, Islamophobia, prisoners' rights, and many more issues. He has acted as legal counsel for several human rights defenders on matters of Palestinian human rights, including CJPME, Dimitri Lascaris, and Students Against Israeli Apartheid at Carleton. So thank you very much, Yavar, for joining us.
Thanks, Michael.
Yavar, bottom line, is BDS legal in Canada? How would you give guidance to Canadians on this?
Sure. So, and thank you very much, Michael, for your presentation, because I think it really provides the context for understanding attacks on what basically amounts to freedom of expression. You mentioned the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and I think that that's pivotal to the expressions that we all have in a free and democratic society to speak opinions which are, there could be differences of opinion in terms of political topics, but the Charter allows that difference to happen. The disagreements are normal. I think where there can potentially be some concern or some stigma attached to the issue of BDS is if some people will take actions around BDS which are not about the expression itself. And so what I want to distinguish is on purely the matter of communication. If I tell you, Michael, that BDS is a good thing, I support BDS, I support the Palestinian campaign, that is lawful legal expression in Canada. If I say, Michael, you better support BDS or else I'll punch you in the face, and I become violent or I make other overtures which are different from my expression, those things can be impugned. But I think what's really important to note, as you yourself have noted, in a free and democratic society, we are allowed to engage in modes of expression, and this is really important and significant because currently, under the laws of Canada and in Ontario in particular, where I am, and I would say across the board right now, but certainly in the Ontario context, there have been movements to try to legislate and control and criminalize speech around BDS, but that has not happened. So certainly in the current context, because there are no laws that try to attack that do criminalize that kind of speech, it is permissible. But the other thing that I'll add to that is that if the government of Ontario or any of the provinces or the federal government attempted to make legislation that says that your political expression is criminal, that would be subject to a challenge under Section 2 of the Charter for that very same reason that we have that basic right in a free and democratic society. And I think that, getting back to my first point, that the expression itself, as you've noted, is about solidarity with Palestinians. It is an expression of human rights. And because of that, intrinsically, it's a message of peace and protection. It is not a message of violence. And I think that where other detractors might say that it is inherently violent, that's just simply incorrect. But I think we can, as I've given an example, we can distinguish the words, the expression from actions associated. The last thing maybe I'll say on this point, Michael, is that there are provisions such as Section 319 of the Criminal Code that is about inciting hate against an identifiable group. But as you've indicated before, in terms of this basic question of whether BDS itself is anti-Semitic, it is not. It is not about attacking any group whatsoever. And as you've noted, the notion that it would be anti-Semitic or attacking people of the Jewish faith is actually inimical to the call out for BDS. So by its very nature, I would say that I've never heard of a case in Canada where there has been an attack on someone expressing support for BDS under the criminal code, or there have been charges laid. Now, the thing that this could also be distinguished with is the case of the rabbi here in Ontario, who was recently charged with a mischief charge. The issue there was not, strictly speaking, about BDS, but it was about a question of whether putting fake, child's paint on the steps of the Israeli embassy really caused some kind of destruction to property. So again, distinguishing the action from the communication or the expression.
Right. So BDS itself is totally fine, but obviously someone, if in addition to BDS or in their expression of BDS, decided to couple that with like vandalism, for example, or hate speech in addition to BDS, or some other sort of things that are against the law already, then obviously that person would get into trouble. And of course, that would be completely in violation of BDS guidelines as well. But that's really helpful. And another thing that we've come across CJPME in the past is, and I'll talk about this more later, but there is a BDS sticky note campaign that CJPME launched with these sticky notes to place on products, Israeli products in the store, to warn consumers, this product, you should boycott it because it's complicit in violations of human rights. And when that was launched, there were some complaints that maybe this is a criminal violation. What do you make of that?
So, I mean, it's a good question. And this was actually one of the subjects in the litigation where I was representing the CJPME in a defamation lawsuit against Ezra Levant and the Rebel News Network. And, part of the context where Rebel News said that CJPME was being anti-Semitic, essentially for its support of BDS, involved this backstory of putting these sticky notes on products. And in support of their claim or their assertion that CJPME was engaging in criminal acts by promoting this, Rebel News had a lawyer on their show opine on this question. So I'll go back to my earlier comments of sort of distinguishing the expression from the action. That's one thing. So expression, fine, legitimate, legal, everything else. Now, one can, and I've done several cases over the years representing, protesters of all sorts who are charged with mischief under the criminal code. And mischief is a pretty broad concept, but it's essentially involved in the protection of property. So as you mentioned, Michael, like if you vandalize something and that, could involve like spray painting it, defacing it, destroying it, things like that, that is, what one can really discern as property damage. When one puts a sticky note on an object, I mean, it's certainly something, we use this concept under criminal law. It's so trivial that the standard called the de minimis standard applies. And so things that are like so small and inconvenience, fundamentally, they don't block access to property of any sort. They can be easily removed, particularly if one can discern that the sticky note is different than the product itself. It would be perhaps a different issue if one thought maybe the sticky note was the product. But I don't really think that's what we're getting into. We're not talking about mislabeling of something to make it a label product that it's not. So I would say, given the de minimis standard, if one wanted to, just as they did to the rabbi here in Ontario, one could bring a mischief charge against him, and that's what's happened. That's what the police have done. Were one to do that for a sticky note case, I would say it would be an absurd case. I would say it'd be a waste of policing resources. But it's such a trivial thing. I don't really see it attracting the sanction of the criminal law.
Tom, did you want to jump in? You were around much longer than I was and involved very much in these cases.
Yeah, well, I I want to just be very clear on one thing first, is that we are talking about sticky notes, which are these things that, like what you use around the office. You write a message to your coworker, you can stick them on things, you pull them off, right? They don't leave a mark, they don't, they're not unremovable. There are things out there. I have seen BDS stickers, which are different. Now, CJPME, we have always used BDS sticky notes, which you stick on, you remove easily. Although I have seen stickers, and might, what Yavar is saying, there might be a slightly different perspective on that, because if you tear off the sticker, maybe it's going to mess up the labeling or something like that. So I just want to make a clear distinction that Yavar's explanation was about sticky notes specifically and not about stickers. The other thing that, not a legal perspective, but just something that I thought about as we launched this campaign a few years ago, is that, if you're a store, I think you want to think long and hard about whether or not you're going to start suing customers and what message that sends. So I think there's also a disincentive for stores to sort of go right and left, launching mischief charges against customers that are doing really these trivial things, as Yavar has mentioned. So just two quick thoughts on that.
Great, thanks, Tom. In the interest of time, we'll move on to the next question. As a human rights lawyer, you've defended the rights of BDS supporters and Palestine solidarity groups on a number of occasions. Can you tell us about some of the more interesting elements of those cases?
Sure. When I had the privilege of representing CJPME against Ezra Levant in the Rebel News Network, there was an interesting thing that I encountered there, and that was the Rebel News doing a spotlight on me. And so what they did, because I was representing CJPME, they made a little, fundraising campaign video to say that, look at this lawyer, he's launching a campaign of Muslim warfare, wherever that came out of. But it was a very well researched thing that said a lot of the work that I've done, and I do represent people of who happen to be Muslim, and I represent people of all religions. But the underlying facts were well researched, but the conclusion I thought was an interesting one, and it kind of goes to when one is involved in advocacy, as CJPME is and others, you may be attacked publicly. So I've seen that happen. When I was representing Dimitri Lascaris before the Superior Court of Justice, he launched a lawsuit against B'nai B'rith for calling him a sympathizer of terrorists because he was advocating for the right of a Palestinian father to get the body of his son back after the son had been killed by Israeli forces. And in the context of the motion that we argued in London, Ontario, when we started getting into the social and political context of what was happening in Israel, there were press reports that the defendant B'nai B'rith put forward in that case, and we started attacking the validity of those things, as one would do in a defamation claim, and the judge was livid. She would not allow me to continue when I started talking about the underlying truth of those issues. And so one of the things that I've noted over the years, when we get into the facts around what's happening on the ground in Israel, even just the reporting of events is a subject that the courts are very uncomfortable with. The last incident or example that I would give you is that in 2006, I represented a professor at York University. That's Professor David Noble, who's now passed away. And he launched a defamation claim, and he's an extremely courageous man, a Jewish professor. And he wrote a little 2-page leaflet in one of his classes called The Tail That Wags the Dog. And this spoke to, and it's timely in some respect, it spoke to a network of organizations with a pro-Zionist affiliation that were also involved in the funding of York University and York University Federation. And within 24 hours of him handing this out, it was just a photocopy in his classroom. The United Jewish Appeal Federation, Canadian Jewish Congress, Hillel, and the York University Federation had all written press releases about him, condemning him as an anti-Semite. And so what I learned back then is, there is a very well-organized lobby that will attack human rights defenders who will be speaking out about the pernicious effects of Zionism on campuses. And the thing that I'll remember from David Noble is, he launched a lawsuit against all these major organizations, and he was just the one person who did it. And he said, if you can't sort of enjoy the struggle, if you can't take part in it in a way where you're not so consumed, you'll never last in this. And so it was sort of a message of humanity and humility that he gave, and he spent a lot of his time doing things that he believed was the morally correct thing to do, and he still he had a sense of humor, and he was a good and caring person. So I think that I've represented many different advocates that support Palestinian human rights, and all of them I think are very humane and caring persons, and I think that that's something that I take with me as an advocate in my struggle, to know that underlying the movement is this sort of sense of solidarity, goodwill, and this kind of bond that goes across all faiths, all political, all underlying stripes of difference, and there's a real strength in that movement.
Thanks, Yavar. I think I have a little bit of a presentation left, but if you'll stick around for a Q&A in just a few minutes, we can pick up on some of this again and take some of the questions from the audience. So thank you very much. So, and if you want, you can turn off your screen for this for just a couple minutes. So we established that it's legal to boycott Israel in Canada, and it's legal to promote a boycott of Israel in Canada, but there have been attempts by federal and provincial governments to discourage or restrict BDS activity. And I did want to touch on these because I think they're important sort of moments. In 2016, Parliament passed a motion which was non-binding and symbolic to condemn any and all attempts by Canadian organizations, groups, or individuals to promote the BDS movement, both here at home and abroad. So condemning BDS and all of its supporters passed with the support of the Liberal government at the time. And similarly, the same year in the Ontario legislature, there was another motion passed to reject the differential treatment of Israel, including BDS. In both of these cases, completely symbolic, no legal significance, but an attempt to essentially threaten and condemn people who would show support for Palestinians. So definitely troubling nonetheless. More troubling, however, is Ontario Bill 202 in 2016, which would have put real restrictions on the right to boycott Israel. If adopted, it would have prevented the Ontario government from hiring anyone who supports the BDS movement, and would have prevented universities and public pension funds from divesting from Israel, similar to some of the US cases. Luckily, the bill was defeated, and there haven't been any attempts similar to this elsewhere in Canada, as far as I'm aware. So certainly no laws in Canada which impact your right to participate in BDS. I did also want to mention IRA quickly. We talked about how it's been adopted by the federal government and by the Ontario government. I did want to point out that obviously this is it poses a pretty significant chill on speech on Israel and Palestine. But I do want to note that just because IRA has been adopted by a government or a city or a university, it doesn't mean that speech about Israel is automatically censored. Instead, what it means is that authorities will be asked to use IRA when adjudicating complaints about anti-Semitism. For example, public officials may have to evaluate whether a call to boycott Israel counts as a double standard, and therefore if it would violate IRA guidelines. Given the subjective nature of IRA, there's a genuine risk that authorities will apply IRA very liberally. And we do know that pro-Israel groups will be putting maximum pressure on them to use IRA in that way, to crack down on speech and activism that is critical of Israel. We see it all over the place already. So while the adoption of IRA is certainly a threat, it's not an automatic attack on political expression, and any censorship will likely come down to a case-by-case basis, depending on how institutions choose to interpret it, or maybe more to the point, coming down to how institutions are pushed by political actors to interpret it, which is kind of the big problem. And maybe I should also give a shout out to the amazing work against IRA that's being done by Independent Jewish Voices, as well as a great collective on university campuses, which has gathered, I think, dozens of faculty associations and student groups passing resolutions opposing IRA and defending the right to academic freedom and free speech on Palestinian human rights. So yeah, there's some really excellent work being done to fight this. In terms of the global case, I did also want to note that there's a number of strategies in other countries to restrict BDS, again, in a very concrete way. So in the United States, there's at least 31 states that have adopted anti-BDS legislation. Some of these laws prevent public institutions from hiring someone unless they sign a statement or an oath promising that they will never boycott Israel, which would apply to people like speech therapists or librarians, that they have to make an oath, an anti-BDS oath, in order to be hired by a university. A number of these laws have been struck down, overturned by the courts, including just yesterday, actually, in the state of Georgia, one was shut down, which is really good news. In the UK in 2016, the government imposed regulations on local councils. So basically making it so that pension funds could not divest from Israel, or really any country if that contradicted the UK's official foreign policy. But thankfully that was overturned by the courts last year, although the government has promised to go forward with new legislation to strengthen that. In France, from 2003 until last year, again, France regarded BDS essentially as a criminal activity by treating a boycott of Israel as discrimination based on national origin, as we had discussed earlier. In 2009, a group of activists were prosecuted and actually given criminal charges for calling for a boycott of Israel. However, last year, there was a major European court case that acquitted the activists and affirmed their freedom of expression to boycott Israel. So considering that France is one of the most repressive cases in the world outside of Israel itself, this is a positive precedent for going forward. But I think that the overall trend is that as BDS becomes more and more popular, becomes more and more seen as a reasonable and necessary response to Israeli oppression, I think there are people who want to make sure that it's less and less of an option. And so there's more repression against BDS the more that BDS becomes popular. And then we already talked about the sticky notes, but I did want to put this on screen again. While there was the claim that defacing products with these sticky notes was the criminal offense, it counted as mischief. Since these things, they don't damage property, they don't make the property useless, they don't obstruct it in any way. It's pretty much inconceivable that a lawsuit would be or criminal charges would be brought against someone who put this little sticky note, this act of protest on Israeli goods in the supermarket, which is good news because happy to announce that we are in a few days going to be launching our Boycott Pillsbury Sticky Notes campaign. Pillsbury is being boycotted by the international BDS movement because it actually has a factory in an illegal Israeli settlement. So until General Mills closes that factory, stops violating international law, they're asking all of us to stop buying Pillsbury products to put pressure on them. So we have these fantastic sticky notes created for us by Carlos Latouf. And if you follow this, you can sign, there's a link on the screen. You can follow that to sign up. We'll send those to you for free. And we actually wanted to get these out earlier, but with recent events, it was postponed. But hopefully we'll see you posting online, you across the country putting these sticky notes on Pillsbury products and raising awareness about this issue and putting pressure on them to leave the settlements. Okay, I was wrapping it up kind of quickly, but I think it's good. We started the event with a question: is BDS anti-Semitic? Is it illegal? The answer, of course, to those is no, even though there's a lot of people who want to make it seem controversial. But BDS ultimately, it's not controversial. It's a very logical, very appropriate and necessary response to injustice, and it's pretty much the least that we can do. So really, thanks to everyone for coming here and for submitting your questions. And now we can have a bit of time for a Q&A. So Tom, have there been any interesting questions come in?
Oh yeah, a lot of good questions here. So thanks to everyone who submitted questions, and you're free to continue to submit questions. Before we jump to a first question or two, just want to throw a question myself to Yavar. So Yavar, Michael talked about that Ontario Bill 202. If Ontario Bill 202 had passed, and that there were restrictions that the province couldn't hire someone who supports BDS, what would be the step that people that support BDS would want to take in that case?
Right. So I think in some analogous way, this would be similar to what's been happening with Quebec with the Bill 2021 and putting sort of restrictions on basic freedoms for becoming part of government. So number one, the first thing to note, it would be affecting government action. So that would immediately engage the charter, and there would be this toss-up between the overriding legislative purpose. Is there some discernible purpose for restricting either creating this compelled speech or restricting BDS in some fashion that can be defensible in a free and democratic society? And as I've indicated before, there isn't one. Like I see that on its face, it's a clear violation of freedom of expression. And ultimately, it would be up to the government to say why in a free and democratic society it's necessary to have that restriction. And that's what's called the Section 1 justification. I don't see that there could be such a justification because of the politics involved. It remains to be seen like how that argument would go. But on the face of it, from legal principles, I don't see that it would pass charter scrutiny.
Right. And as Michael pointed out, very similar cases, the courts have determined that similar laws in the states have been struck down because, again, they violate this principle of freedom of expression. So I just wanted to make sure the audience understood that. And to Michael's point as well, a motion is different than a law. So in as much as the federal government, the federal parliament has passed a motion, and then the Ontario parliament has passed a motion, it really has no legal impact, as Michael pointed out. And there has been confusion, as we've observed, between a motion and a law. And people think, well, wasn't there a law passed? No, it was just a motion, which is sort of a statement of position on the part of Parliament. So thank you for that, Yavar. One or two questions here. Does a few people, Brian, sorry, as I think it's Ala and Felix, are asking about the Human Rights Watch report that came out a few weeks ago, saying that Israel is engaging in the crime against humanity of apartheid and persecution. Does that in any way impact or strengthen the BDS case? Either of you?
I can't speak from sort of a legal perspective. I think it Obviously, apartheid is a crime under international law, and it does point in Canada, for example, to ways that the Canadian government and Canadian policy might actually be supporting that crime of apartheid or complicit in it. For example, one of the major problems is the settlement enterprise, and Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement doesn't make a distinction between products in Israel and in the settlement. So products that are from illegal Israeli settlements are they're illegal under international law, but they get preferential trade status under our trade agreements. So that's a very material benefit that we are, a very material form of support that we are giving to the settlements. Now, that's already against the law, but perhaps the crime of apartheid is seen as more, maybe there's different grounds for sort of saying that this is really bad for Canada to be doing this. But it also, while the Human Rights Report was focused on the crime of apartheid, which is a universal standard, they didn't make a connection to South Africa. I do think the fact that South Africa was committing that crime, that Israel was committing that crime, that there's more opportunity for making comparisons between the cases. And I think there's lots of legitimate comparisons to be made, including the comparison of the struggle, which involved boycotts, divestment, sanctions, and these things. If BDS was a legitimate response to apartheid in South Africa, then why would it not be legitimate as a response to apartheid committed by Israeli officials as well? So certainly, I think it definitely bolsters a lot of, it has a possibility for bolstering activism, but it's also a very grave legal problem that Canada should be doing everything it can to be seen as not supporting. So that's what I would say.
Well, one thing that I might add to that as well is that I think there has been, maybe not so much today, but in recent years, there's been a lot of hesitation around using that word. Like the mainstream media hasn't, called, it hasn't named Israeli apartheid. And I think that the hesitancy around that in part is because people feel that they may be labeled anti-Semitic for saying that and using those terms. So one of the things that it does for people who are, I would argue, slandered in that way and called an anti-Semite because of that, the Human Rights Watch report provides, a source of legitimacy for calling out what's happening on the ground, apartheid. So I think based on that, it normalizes the discourse such that, people who are criticized in that way can actually take those detractors to task and don't have to just simply resile and not, not be clear about what they're calling out.
Yeah, excellent points. Thanks to both of you on that. There's a question here from Kwan, who's asking about the case of the food vendors store in Toronto, and if you guys have any opinion on that, whether that ties in this sort of the question of BDS. I think I don't know that the attack on food vendors was related specifically to food vendors' promotion of the BDS campaign. But do either of you have a comment about that food vendors case and where it stands and what legally position that store might be in?
I'm not sure I have anything to say. Maybe Yavar does.
The only thing, and I'll sort of be careful in this commentary, just because and people might know the individual involved and the store, and I think it sort of goes back to whether wittingly or unwittingly comments are made that could be negative in addition to something where there is support for BDS. I think that there's a concern where those things are conflated. I think that's one of the complexities of that case. But I would just sort of bring it back to the original point that we said at the top of this webinar, that a clear statement of BDS is not, is not anti-Semitic. It shouldn't attract hate speech, and it's defended by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So, if there's other things in addition to that, that's where that can raise legal complexity.
Yeah, just give me just a second. Sorry, I had an incoming call to our landline. I guess you can still hear the ring. Sorry about that, folks. So thanks to both of you on that. There's a question here that isn't specific to the legal question around BDS or the anti-Semitic question, but there's a question here about whether or not BDS, the BDS movement, might be a catalyst for the shifting discourse around Israel's human rights abuses, and how you guys might perceive that.
Well, I think it has been. I think BDS really emerged in the early 2000s and has been on the forefront of changing the narrative around Israel's human rights violations in pretty significant ways, including by making sure that our focus is drawn, and we didn't get into that in this webinar, but when we talk about what the goals of BDS are, it's not just about the occupation, but about equality within Israel and the right of return for Palestinian refugees. So that's one way that it has helped to change things. It's also been a pretty powerful force on campuses in changing the way that Palestinian activism has taken shape. So it's not just expressions of support for Palestine, but very practical ways that people can intervene and take charge in the places where they inhabit in their own lives, again, as a consumer or as a student on a campus or as a laborer, a union member. And so I think it's shaped so many things. It's not the only, I guess, force probably contributing to these political changes, but I think it's been putting in work against the odds and against all of these attacks and condemnations and smear campaigns. But I think the fact that you saw Human Rights Watch come out with this report and being free to say the word apartheid, I think the fact that we saw Jagmeet Singh call for an arms embargo against Israel in question period, all of these things are the legacy of the BDS movement in, I think, a pretty direct way. So I think it's fantastic, and I think that with another 20 years, things could look quite different in terms of how the world responds to Israeli violations.
Yavar, anything to add?
No, I would totally echo those comments, and I think that one of the things that it does in the shifting discourse is, as the speech of calling out Israeli apartheid becomes normalized, is not considered to be anti-Semitic, as the actions of BDS, which for whether it's just because people are hesitant to say the speech or to manifest that in some way because it's becoming more normalized. I think it's giving strength to the movement, but it's also allowing people to speak about what's happening. So I think that the speech is reinforcing the action and the choices, and because that discourse is enlarging, people are also becoming more aware of what's happening. So all of these things are reinforcing each other. But I think part of what we've seen over, how things have evolved in the last 2 decades is because there was such a chill in terms of what you could say. I think in some sense, it's not a legal thought, but how we express ourselves really impacts on how we conceptualize things. And when we don't feel we can use certain words or certain terms, I don't think we have the ability to analyze and see the world in a critical way.
Okay. Gosh, I'm just being assaulted by telephone calls here. I'm looking at the clock. It looks like about 9:05 for here for me. We have 2 or 3 final questions that relate to the legal angle. We have a lot of questions that relate sort of to BDS in general, but why don't we just look at 1 or 2 of these remaining questions that relate specifically to legality and BDS, and then we'll wrap up here for the evening. So one question I see here is, from Ada again, is it a crime under any laws in Canada to create a short video calling out companies and posting them to YouTube or other platforms based on the UN report on the list of companies that are complicit in Israel's human rights violations? Would there be any legal implications to someone doing that, calling out companies or criticizing companies or doing videos, calling out
So
companies?
thanks. I can answer that, Tom. So two things. I think that first of all, no. But the other thing is that companies are obviously sensitive. The information, because it's coming from a credible source, you'd rely on that source. When you're saying it, you'd quote that source. If you were slapped with some kind of litigation, say either saying it's not true or you didn't believe it or something to that effect, there would also be a defense because you would be directly promoting the course of human rights by referring to that. So there is protections, at least in the province of Ontario and some of the provinces, against strategic litigation if one were tried to be sued for that. But I think despite the fact that the CBC and some mainstreams haven't picked up that report, the report is clearly a credible source and it can be relied upon.
Anything to add, Michael, or is you good at that? Okay. Another question here on the legal side is, we've talked about, well, if a province were to pass a law that would then, outlaw a certain type of behavior under BDS, what about the cost? Mohammed here has a question of, okay, well, fine, it's great. You're saying take things into the courts, but what about the cost for people who are, dealing with the cost of defending themselves? Any perspective on that you guys would like to comment on?
So defending oneself against a defamation claim, I think it's always challenging. I'm not going to downplay that, particularly in the higher courts and the superior courts. The fees can be quite high. But one of the things, sort of harkening back to how BDS is changing things, I think, as opposed to 15 or 20 years ago when you couldn't for any reason talk about BDS, talk about Israeli apartheid in a very open way. I think because that's shifted, it's difficult. It's more difficult now to credibly attack someone for saying something that's true, saying something that is, has credible sources like the Human Rights Watch report behind it. So I think that there's a less of, I guess, a likelihood that companies would take you on solely because you're pointing out things which are defensible based on, reports and other public domain sources that are credible.
Yeah. And maybe let's wrap up with a question related, which ties into this a bit, is Yavar, do you want to talk to us just a moment about sort of the anti-SLAPP laws and explain what anti-SLAPP laws are and how they might come into play in something like this?
So in Ontario and also in some of the other provinces, there have been legislative amendments in about the last 5 to 10 years, which are protections against what's called strategic litigation against public participation. That's a long word to say that sometimes companies, usually big companies, will sue you because you're calling them out. You're saying things that are true, you're saying things that are accurate, but the company just wants to shut you down because they don't want bad press. So what the anti-SLAPP legislation says is that it says that you can bring a motion as the defendant, the responding party in the litigation, to say that your expression was a genuine expression on an issue of a public interest. And when you meet the criteria of having like a basic defense, a credible defense, and you're engaging in that public discourse, you have a way of striking out that claim against you. So it's an additional thing in addition to the defenses that we have under defamation law to protect basically the small person from being squashed by the big company.
Right. And my understanding, and just to just to also put a slightly broader perspective on that as well, is that pro-Israel organizations can use that as well, I guess, right? And sort of say, well, you don't criticize us, don't attack us, don't sue us for defamation, because you're just trying to shut us up. Any comments on that? Anything that you've observed?
Oh yeah, certainly. That kind of anti-slap can be used the other way, but it would depend on a lot of factors, including what the balance of power is between the organization. So not all pro-Israel groups, but the network of many organizations, whether it's B'nai B'rith or CJA or the larger groups, are extremely well funded. So I think that one of the things that the courts will look at is this a matter of a big and powerful corporation just trying to get its way, or really is it a large corporate defendant who is trying to use the benefit of this anti-slap laws to basically get away with doing or saying whatever they want. So embedded within that legislation is some kind of limitation to avoid that kind of abuse.
Yeah, fantastic. Michael, would you want to have anything to say as we wrap up here? I think there's been a great Q&A.
Yeah, just that it's been a pleasure, Yavar, for you to join us, and thanks to the audience. Maybe Tom, you can take people out, but
Sure.
but thanks everyone for joining. I saw a comment in the Q&A. Just want to make a comment. I thought BDS was illegal in Canada. I think that's the way it's portrayed in the media. This talk has been a real eye-opener for me. So thank you to Bill for that comment. Clearly, there's so much misinformation about BDS, so I was really happy that we could put this together and help to kind of clear up some of that.
Absolutely. Yes, Michael. We have gone a little bit over time, but we did have some good questions out there. We have focused on the questions that sort of specifically address the legal question. We didn't have too many questions about the anti-Semitism side of things. So that's why we didn't get into that too much in the Q&A. But we did have a lot of questions overall. So thanks to all of you who typed in your questions. Maybe Michael, maybe you want to take a snapshot of the questions that we have, and if possible, for some of the questions that don't relate specifically to the legal side of things, we may try and reach out to folks after the call in the coming days and try to answer your calls, try to answer your questions via email, because many of these questions we can answer, simple things about BDS in general. Again, I do refer people to our very first session on BDS where we did address some of these things. So again, a big thanks to Yavar Hameed for joining us here tonight. Yavar, I know you're a very busy man. We really, really appreciate the time that you took to come here and join us tonight, and really a very refreshing perspective and an authoritative perspective that as Michael read, at least for one person, really clarified the situation. And I think it's a situation that constantly needs to be clarified. So thanks for standing up and thinking these things through. And thanks for your work defending people who've been attacked on these things, Yavar.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for your work, and Michael as well.
Great, thanks. Well, with that, we'll call it an evening. Thanks again for all the folks for joining us, and stay tuned. We will have additional sessions on BDS in the months to come. So thanks again for joining us. Good night.